Maybe just as a start, recognizing that we've got everybody back, and Greer, we highlighted you at the start, but you didn't have a speaking part. Now that you've had the chance to hear what everybody had to say, and given that you were instrumental in helping to pull this session together, did you just have any comments or perspectives that you wanted to share, or maybe a question you'd want to put to others on the panel just to kick us off here?
Yeah, as I was hearing everyone present, I actually started to see how all of these perspectives can come together, talking and thinking about the process and then how that relates to salmon, and then using tools like Chris talked about with floodplain restoration and Nick looking at flood or connectivity and barrier removal. All of those come into play, I think, when you think holistically across a landscape as a manager or practitioner, or someone who's really working to push a collaborative effort forward. So I see their connection across all these talks. So I'm excited about this panel discussion to see how we can start to pull together different thoughts into more of a holistic impression of moving forward. I don't have any particular questions, but I'll let you know.
All right. Thanks, Greer. Laura, I'm thinking maybe I'll just invite the other panelists one at a time. I'll go to Ellen first and then pass the baton to you, but just to see if there's any comments having heard the other speakers this morning. So, Ellen, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but you started us off, so that's always a bit daunting. But now that you've had the chance to hear what others said that built on your talk, would you have any comments or perspectives you want to share with the people in the session with us today?
No, I don't think so. I think I'll wait to see if we have questions from the participants in the workshop.
Okay, well, maybe I'll follow along from that just quickly. Pete, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Only that it's gratifying to see that our approach and view to restoration is broadening out now from specific sites to whole watersheds. I think that's definitely a step in the right direction.
And how about you, Chris?
I think the one thing that stuck out to me is just the idea that there's lots of different definitions to resiliency, right? We all focus on different metrics for resiliency. So I think that's one of the key points, I think.
Okay, and Nick, I'll go to you before I flip it over to Laura to add her moderator's perspective or go to questions. Or anything you want to
add? Well, again, I had the last word, so I was able to draw on everyone else, but I agree with Pete again that our inspiration in doing this and thinking at that watershed scale comes from, the advances that have been made in restoration ecology of recognizing, work at that scale, restore processes first, connectivity second, and local sites third, for instance, is the simplification of that concept. And that's what we're trying to honor, even if we're working kind of in the middle of that rather than at the whole hog ideal place to be working.
Sounds good. Well, Laura, why don't I throw the mic back to you?
Great. Sure. I appreciate that comment there, Nick, that really pulls a lot together. I'm going to grab the first question on the top of the list because I'm curious as well, and I think I know the answer. I think the fact that we're all here today indicates that we all have a sense of hope and optimism, but I'd like to hear from the panel if anyone would like to comment. You feel optimistic that the level of restoration effort being applied, thinking of the Pacific Northwest or across the range of Pacific salmon, will it be enough? Is it enough to save our threatened and endangered salmon stocks? Is anyone on the panel who'd like to take a first stab at sharing the thoughts on that? Or not? Are we feeling optimistic? Are we feeling hopeful?
Somewhat. I think there's cases where I am optimistic and hopeful and realistic. I think there are great case studies of recovery, and so that makes me optimistic. I think the reality is we will lose some of these populations. They're on a path to extinction, and the efforts being made right now are not sufficient to recover them. Populations that have dropped from 5,000 returns to 500 to 50 individuals are not, don't make me particularly optimistic, but that's not all stocks and all populations of all species. So that's what's great. The other thing I would just say, though, is that the habitat restoration and the habitat resiliency components need to be paired with the stocking and enhancement considerations that Pete brought up, as well as the harvest management, and particularly the multi-stock harvest management that's been really hammering lower productivity populations within combined populations. And these are areas that need as much attention, I think, as the habitat restoration.
Can I add that Bob Lackey from Oregon State University for several decades now has been making a powerful argument that optimism is misplaced with regard to Pacific salmon. And whether you agree or not with Bob's thesis, it's important to at least consider that viewpoint and ask yourself the question, if this is true, if we're looking to a future where there will be relatively small remnant runs of salmon, particularly at the lower ends of the range, how can we best position those so when somehow things change at some distant point in the future, that they'll be able to recover as efficiently as possible?
Well, Pete, maybe I could ask a follow-up to that, and it connects to something Nick said right at the end of his talk. And Nick, I might invite you to think about a follow-up on this too. You talked about thinking, Nick, about process, that channel, I'm assuming you meant like channel forming process, of hydrologic type process. And that connects to Alan's talk, and then Pete, your talk I think was around how fish diversity responds to that. But in the context of now thinking about the point that you made, Pete, about I'm happy to see that we're looking at restoration differently through this thread of conversation. Can you elaborate a bit on, so where do you think we should go? Or what kinds of things should we be thinking about more to take restoration into a direction where maybe it can have even more benefit or have greater ongoing success than the restoration the way we've done it in the past has?
Yeah, that's a really good question, one that I certainly don't have a very complete answer to, but I will make the comment that restoration in general has tended to focus on sort of the topic du jour of ways to improve things. I recall, for example, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was some interest in trying to restore nutrients to streams. And so for a while, there were extensive programs to take hatchery fish and drive a truck full of school kids out to the nearest bridge and have them throw the fish into the streams to benefit the salmon. And I think subsequent monitoring didn't show a particularly strong effect of that, and so it was given up. And then if you look further along the various types of restoration things, we tended to jump from one hot topic to the next. I don't know if that's necessarily the best approach. I for example, don't believe that it's prudent to give up on looking more closely at nutrients and nutrient processes in streams. I think that it's important to recognize the various types of restoration, including both bioengineering solutions and passive restoration. And I think overall that diversifying our restoration approaches is probably in the long term might be not a bad approach.
I appreciate that answer. Nick, since I kind of pulled off your thread there when you talked about process, would you like to comment on that theme?
Yeah, well, I think it ties back into this concept that if we're going to have long-term sustainable salmon habitats, we need to think at that watershed scale, and we need to think about, not just the in-stream, but the land use effects on that. And, this kind of goes back to these concepts of sustainable development, right? There's going to be a trade-off between human uses in a watershed and habitat quality for fish. And there's not a right answer as to where those trade-offs lie. But in the absence of a plan and in the absence of decision-making that connects the use of the floodplain, the use of riparian zones, the use of in-stream habitats and terrestrial habitats, we're not going to get to a point where we have a way to exist in a watershed in perpetuity where salmon and humans can coexist. And that sounds overly complex, and I think the complicated parts are bringing the different decision makers and societal interests together. But from a science and planning perspective, it's not that complicated when you think about saying, okay, we need to actually quantify and map out 6 to 10 dimensions of fish habitat and how they're all being managed in an area, and where are they at today and where would we like them to be in the future. I think that's more achievable, and we're working with the Atlantic Salmon Federation on the East Coast, and that's sort of the intent of where they're heading for their wild salmon watershed program. So excited to see those initiatives, because I think they have promise in tying all of those habitat components together.
Thank you. Ellen, would you like to comment on that, since I think it ties back to the piece that you started us out with today?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to what Nick said. Realistically, I think we have to, it's a terrible right thing to say, but we have to think globally and act locally.
Do you see anybody doing that? Like, should we all be going to somebody's webpage or seminar who's got the leading light on taking this challenging concept and turning it into some kind of reality?
No one is coming to mind initially as the single best. A lot of people are working on this, but no, I can't point you to a specific resource that I think is a really good example yet.
Maybe that's a common challenge for all of us in the field. And Chris, did you want to comment on this? I know, like, you are doing it, and you're doing it at that local scale, but you're working on more than just a site-specific footprint type project, right?
We are. So, one of the things that's great about working with the Umatilla tribes is that, they have that river vision. And as part of that river vision, it's really that idea that we need to restore floodplains. And I think that when we get to the level of restoring floodplains, and we're at least getting into the ballpark, right, of doing something good for salmon. So I really like that idea. I think that there should be some sideboards on the type of projects that we do. And I think maybe, if they're not doing something to improve floodplain connectivity, then maybe we should think about, other uses of some of those funds. I've definitely spent a lot of time in my career, looking at other projects and living both in Oregon and Washington, and, we learn, we start out, doing small projects because we were scared to do anything. And, as these projects have grown, we get more and more aggressive. And I hope that, as we do that, that we are definitely making sure that, floodplain connectivity is part of that. So.
Well, thanks. I know I could throw questions at the panel here all morning, and I don't want to take over. So maybe, Laura, I'll turn back to you and see if you either have a question or want to go to the Slido.
Yeah, well, I think I'll draw from the Slido, because I know we've got a lot of questions that we've saved from each of the presenters today, and I'm sure there are more new questions coming in. And so the one sitting at the top right now that's been there for quite a while: during drought events, certain streams become inaccessible and salmon may spawn in non-natal streams. Is there a general consensus regarding this type of movement in terms of genetic resilience? Is there a risk of homogenizing gene flow across populations? So I'll put that question out to the panel, and I'm hoping that someone may want to take a bite to try to respond to that.
I'll take a start, and maybe some of the others can contribute to the idea that salmon only move downstream from their natal sites is may not be a correct assumption in all cases. That some work in Alaska, for example, show that some populations of coho, when the fry emerge from the gravel, actually move upstream, and I think that movement in all directions can happen in salmon, that's particularly species that spend an extended time in fresh water, and that means upstream to smaller, cooler tributaries where available, or laterally to groundwater fed side channels and ponds along the floodplain. So I think that it's important to remember that well, I think UBC professor Tom Northcote wrote an excellent summary paper, I think it was back in the 70s, that pointed out that fish, particularly anadromous fish, move for two reasons: one to find food and the other for shelter. And so there's going to be selection for behavior that facilitates those two things, finding food resources and finding places to be sheltered, either from high flows or predators or whatever. So that's something to keep in mind.
Anyone else on the panel that would like to follow up with Pete's comment there? All right. Well, there's a question at the top that's come up, and it's really addressed broadly to the panel, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. So the question reads, what are the most important unknowns or unanswered questions that we need to study to better understand resilience in a watershed restoration context? And how can public lands managers work better with researchers to help answer them? We've sort of got a two-part question. So anyone on the panel who'd like to try to take a stab at both components, or if you feel comfortable to at least address part of it, I invite anyone to try that.
Yes, I'll respond to the first part.
Wonderful.
It's something that I ended the talk with. We don't know how much or where we need in terms of highly functional segments of river networks. So if we go back to the bead string idea, if we're going to restore or protect beads, how many do we need? Where should they be? How big should they be? How functional? In terms of working with practitioners, there's two parts to being able to answer that question eventually. One is having field-based measurements of what's happening at the reach scale, and the other is feeding those into numerical models that are continuing to be developed. So the help would come in monitoring restoration projects for a variety of parameters, maybe not just fish response, for example, and also funding the people who can do this model development. I'm not one of them, but helping those people get the resources they need to continue to develop and calibrate these models, I would say, is critical.
Absolutely. Anybody else on the panel would like to contribute?
Laura, I'll follow up on that Ellen's comment, because I hear a lot about needs related to this topic, and one that comes right to mind is just even mapping floodplains across the entire stream network. You know, we talk about beads on the string, but we don't even have a basic layer showing where those potential beads are. So I'm really trying to at least start at that scale. You know, Nick described how we've done that with barriers, and I could foresee having a similar process of starting with a map and talking where we dig into that assessment that Ellen mentioned. What is the current status of those floodplains? Are they connected or disconnected? We can use vegetation and other even land sat or imagery, satellite imagery, to see what the status of those floodplains are across a large area. And so that's the road I'm trying to go down, is say, can we map these? Can we assess their condition now? And then dig into some ability to prioritize restoration of those areas using local knowledge and goal setting.
I would strongly second that. The only comment I'd add is that what Greer just describes may sound really easy. And it could be if you're working on a river the size of what's in back of her on this computer screen. But if you're working in a first, second, third order stream, we don't have good tools for delineating those, especially in forested regions. Even sub-meter LiDAR may not be sufficient, which sounds silly, but that's been my experience.
Yep,
I think,
absolutely. We need more
Greer's
people on the ground. Go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Sorry, Laura. I was just thinking about Greer's comment, just about the idea of space, right? And that's really seems like the thing that we always argue about and try to figure out. The toucan, right now we're trying to figure out, how much space does the river actually need, so that we can try to make sure that we're allowing enough space for the river to be able to have those natural processes and being able to be, self-sufficient. So that seems like, that goes right along with your floodplain idea, Greer, and just, some way to map this stuff so that we can start to think about these things at a larger scale.
I'll add one thing just to make everyone's life difficult. We also have to think about changing climate. And in my part of the world, that means we can have smaller floodplains because we're going to have less water most of the time. But I don't think that's necessarily the case in the Pacific Northwest and Pacific salmon areas. So what are you going to have? Are you going to have bigger floods? Are you going to have more flow? But building that understanding of projected climate change and hydrological change into efforts, I think, is key.
The perspective I'd add for managers, I mean, certainly managers have a lot to do in collaboration with researchers in terms of providing that local knowledge, assisting with the monitoring, assisting with the evaluation, the data sets. I think about it from a decision-making perspective, which is that, the more you dig into the science and the unanswered questions, the more unanswered questions there are, and the more imperfections there are. And we have to figure out how to translate that into, practical management efforts that don't end up being wasted efforts, or if they are, it's in an adaptive management context where we tried something and we learned that it didn't work and we won't try it again. That's acceptable. And so, I present our models as being conclusive about the 13 barriers that are important in the horsefly, but the reality is we don't, there's a lot that we don't know about the salmon habitat quality in that river. We don't necessarily know where the thermal refuges are, or the highest quality spawning habitat is, right? So we kind of have a kilometers of habitat, not habitat quality. And even if we modeled that, it would be far off what it actually is on the ground. So we've come up with a practical approximation that can be applied at a reasonable time length and with reasonable resources that hopefully captures the most important or the likely most important big patches of habitat and focuses our attention there. And I think that kind of thinking can be applied to any of the other types of restoration considerations, whether that's floodplains, riparian zones, thermal refuge. How can you, with the resources you have, how can you come up with an informed answer and take action that's likely to be important, even if it's imperfect? I think the one exception to that is Chris's presentation, which is when you're actually going to get to a spot in that watershed and start fiddling, well, now you can't approximate. If you don't get rivers right, your project will fail. And so that's the point where you have to invest in really understanding the hydrogeomorphology and getting your design right.
Nick, I have a question for you. Have you, in your prioritization of the horsefly, did you rely primarily on ground-based surveys, or have you made use of remote sensing? Because there seems to be some interest in expanding some of our newer remote sensing tools to help identify some of these areas that are important.
Yeah, there's a great paper from the Rivers Institute in New Brunswick from 2023 that looks at, watershed scale LiDAR-based identification of barriers and prioritization for them. We didn't have those data available, and because of the work that the province had put into mapping, predicting where all of these structures were, we, as I say now, we can kind of take these data and at a watershed scale, find your maybe top 20 or top 100 structures with about 5 to 10K in staff effort. So that's a lot less than creating an entire LiDAR model of that watershed and interpolating it. But if the LiDAR data are available, that's something I'm interested in following up on, because if you can, 10 years ago, the efforts to do that failed at accurately predicting which crossings were barriers. And, in the past 5 years, there have been advances there. So there's definitely potential.
Well, I think it's a great comment, Nick. I think one of the things that we're fortunate about in the Toucan is, we do have a pretty good prioritization. And, we started that in 2010. And then we've continued to learn from, our prioritization. We redid our prioritization in 2020 after doing restoration for 10 years. And we've really tried to focus, on our limiting factors. What are they in the Toucan? And we've tried to make them, as clear as possible. We really think about the lack of floodplain connectivity, channel complexity caused by stream power. And, most of the Toucan has been levied. It's a small system, so we're lucky to get to work in a system like that. It's 58 miles long. But we probably have over 50 miles of levees in the system. So it's been heavily manipulated. So we're trying to figure out how best to, move those things and move those barriers so that we have space for the river. So I think we've been somewhat successful in that. And, one of the things that we're also lucky about is we have, the full river basin geomorphic change detection. And that's starting to teach us a little bit about, what we're doing in the basin and how that's affecting up and downstream. And so we're trying to figure out, how large do these projects need to get to be able to see, a difference. And so we're just starting to be able to detect some of that stuff. And there's some exciting work going to come out of that, in the next few years. We just need another high flow. That's the part of climate change that we're not liking, is that, our flows are going down and we only see, 1 year flows, we don't see anything higher than that very often. So, and we're really counting on the river to do the work. So, so do we need to change change our thought process around that? Or what? We have spring Chinook that are, right on the cusp of extinction. So we're trying to act quickly. We're also trying to make sure that we're not acting too quickly. So we're trying to learn. So.
Well, Chris, that thought around populations that are kind of on the brink, it goes to a question that's been sitting in our Slido queue here. I think our team might have just bumped it to the one below, but it was around some populations being really close and on the brink. Other ones, their large populations might also be reducing, but with the lens of diversity and population resiliency. How do we reconcile that? Where should restoration and or conservation efforts be focused? And so, Pete, I might direct that to you first, just because you spoke about the diversity of populations, and don't ignore the small ones. I think there's something to that effect. And how do you take a question like this and put some order or some thinking or some of that biodiversity consideration to it?
Well, I guess I would draw, good question. I would draw examples from systems that had major restoration work on them, such as the Elwha River in Washington or the Klamath River in Oregon. These are rivers that had historically significant salmon populations. In the case of the Elwha, for example, it was one of the few rivers in the entire state that had all 7 anadromous species spawning in it. I'm pretty sure that's the case. And in the Klamath River, it represented actually an area that historically supported a very high level of biodiversity. In fact, some of the archaeological excavations from around Klamath Lake have found the presence of sockeye salmon bones in them. So I can see where at least providing access to those rivers or sites that were nodes of regional biodiversity could factor into selection of areas for restoration attention.
I don't think I've heard that term before applied to salmon, at least in my circles, that nodes of regional biodiversity. It would be an interesting thing to explore a bit further. But Chris, maybe I'll just turn to you, because I was kind of picking up on your thread around, so we've got this Chinook population, it's going down fast, and we're trying to step in and do things in a thoughtful way that might hold the line and maybe enable some recovery. So have you had to reconcile this issue of, why did you pick there and that population to be the place where you worked in the scheme of potentially having other opportunities?
Well, early on, the Toucan was selected as a model watershed. So the work's been going on there, since the late 90s. So, and with any basin, you start small and then you get bigger as you move on. So we've been trying to reconcile our work around both the needs of what salmon need. We don't have a lot of salmon coming into the basin, but we do have some, and we're trying to make sure that there's enough spawning habitat and enough over summer habitat and enough over winter habitat. We're just trying to make sure that where we work isn't affecting salmon too greatly. Obviously we have an adult trap in the basin, and we've been keeping most of our fish for brood the last several years, and so that allows us to work above the basin without too much, or above the adult trap without too much harm. But we think about those things, and we work with our fish production folks trying to make sure that we're all on board with the work that's being going on and going to go on. So trying to make sure communication is a big part of what we do. So
that makes sense.
Yeah, that idea of communication ties to a question that I see here on the Slido. So I think I'll just carry that theme on it, asking about specific outreach tools or effective ways of reaching, say, private landowners or other stakeholders that may have that may bring different interests to the table. So, Chris, I'll maybe put that to you first, but perhaps others on the panel might also have some thoughts to share of just how to reach those different groups that all have a stake, so to speak, in
It's
the
a great
watershed
question.
management.
It's a great question. It's always a challenge, right? It just depends on where you're at and where you're working, as far as how receptive people are to the type of work you might be want to do. When we first started working in the Sprague River and the Klamath Basin, people were pretty up in arms. And so we went around and we had to go and meet with people on the ground where they live and, ask them about their creeks and ask them what they thought about, the work and what we needed to do. And just to mostly to listen, right? Because that was the one thing that people really thought that they hadn't had a chance to have done, is to be listened to. And so, those meetings early on, really set the stage for, how we moved forward. So every watershed is a little bit different, but, in the Toucan, we try to have a barbecue every couple of years and try to invite everybody. When you say that, how do you get out and get people involved? Some people respond to emails, some people respond to letters, but lots of people respond to, going out and knocking on some doors. So that's not, it's a tough ask to go out and do that, but that's where you get your most success. And that's where people respond and actually show up to your meetings. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Building those relationships, having that face-to-face time. Yeah, investing, right?
That's exactly right.
Anyone else on the panel want to add to that? It reminds me of Ellen in her talk, referring to a talk she's given. She said a number of times, referring to messy rivers, putting into a language that and terminology that maybe it reaches a broader audience. And just for people who might be interested in hearing that talk, our hardworking team behind the scenes has found a publicly available version of your talk on messy rivers. So we'll be sure to get that link provided to the full audience when we send out sort of a thank you at the end of the workshop. So we'll be sure to get that available for anyone who wants to see that talk.
Well, I might just connect to that. Alan, I kind of asked Pete the question around, okay, how do you look at priorities for the salmon when you have these conundrums of, do you go to the most fish or do you go maintain the maximum biodiversity? How do you look at priorities when it comes to the morphology from the context of the watershed? I followed the beads and strings idea, and it makes sense. But then it's like, okay, so what do we do, and what things do you push to the top of the list? And do you have any kind of applied thoughts on that might help the audience in their thinking?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple aspects to it. One is feasibility or accessibility. So I'm in the Western U.S., and a lot of the higher elevation or higher in the catchment sites are owned by the federal government. They're more accessible than private lands. So you work with the Forest Service, the Park Service, for example, and the Canadian equivalents to focus on public lands. The other is at a much smaller spatial scale. If you're looking at individual beads, say I would focus on the beads for sure. Think about how to connect the channel and floodplain if they have become disconnected. And connect in this sense means facilitating movement of water and sediment and the organisms that would go with the water between the channel and floodplain. And that's the whole stage zero idea in many cases. So you can either recontour the whole channel and floodplain using heavy equipment and then leave it to adjust, or you can put obstructions into the channel to force the flow to go over bank, or you can do some combination of both. And thinking about what obstructions would naturally occur in a particular type of bead. Again, I'll just use beaver dams and log jams as examples, but there are marshy beads where reinstating native herbaceous vegetation, rushes and sedges, for example, might be the most important thing. So it's where can you get access to and get permission to do things, and then prioritizing the beads and connecting those beads to the whole river corridor. If you put obstructions in the channel, for example, you're going to increase the connectivity between the channel and floodplain. You're also going to increase the vertical connectivity, because an obstruction, whether it's a single large boulder, a single piece of wood, a structure across the channel, will create pressure gradients that facilitate hypereic exchange too.
The other one I'll add to that, Jason, that I hear often is tributary confluence areas are hotspots for both process and fish and biodiversity. So definitely confluence areas in addition to the beads. And then I'll also mention estuaries, obviously, are really important areas for restoration within the context of watershed resilience and salmon recovery. And I've been thinking also more about areas, lower in our watersheds that have been incised and disconnected for a variety of reasons. And although there's not the wider floodplain that we once had, there is a floodplain, and we've often overlooked the importance of those highly inundated areas that have created gravel bars and are impaired, and trying to push forward ideas of how we could restore those gravel bars and banks in a way that restores some of the process that those provided for fish and for habitat and food webs.
Yeah, it's a good way to kind of connect those dots, right? And that's present context. Where I think the restoration community are understanding that we need to look beyond just the footprint of a project and look at process and look at systems and look at the diversity and complexity. But now we have to kind of turn on okay, so how do we do that? And, maybe I'll use that as kind of a bridge to head us towards our lunch wrap up. But maybe I sometimes find it useful to go back to the panelists after a session like this and say, so do you have a concluding thought that you'd like to share with the audience, either based on your talk or based on what you've heard from some of the others or from some of the questions? And maybe I'll just start going in maybe reverse order of the way people spoke. And because, Nick, I know you a bit, I'll put you on the spot. Do you have a concluding thought in brief form that you'd like to share or summarize or leave with the room here?
I think the thing that's been sticking with me is from Pete's presentation. I've learned quite a bit about salmon genetics and other fish genetics and their considerations in fisheries management. And I think I came into this talk with a bit more of an assumption that, if salmon have a 5% strain rate, then when we lose a population in a tributary, then it's going to be very difficult to recover. And so I think I drew a lot of hope from the learning, from what I learned about their genetic plasticity and the potential that has for recovery, and maybe some of the explanation of, in the Okanagan, in the Elwha, the recovery that we've seen. So that's left me with more optimism on that dimension.
Chris, how about you?
I think the one thing that sticks out to me is just, the idea around communication. We've worked a lot in our upper watersheds. Those are kind of the low-hanging fruit. As we start to move downriver, like Greer talked about, all those lands are going to be privately owned, and it's going to be important for us to be communicating with those people about what the wants and needs are. And the one thing that's always stuck out to me is just the need to start slow at the beginning so that you can go fast at the end. And that means making sure that you get around to everybody and talk to them. You might not get everybody there the first time, but keep trying and making sure that you get them there, because that way, once you have them, you've explained it to them all once, and you don't have to explain it over and over again, and you can go fast with the solution, as you develop, that relationship and that trust. So.
Thanks, Chris. How about you, Pete?
In a word, long-term monitoring. I think that this is the thing that has provided the most useful information for people in trying to understand resilience. And I know I sound like a broken record on this one, but long-term monitoring is so helpful, and it deserves to continue to be supported.
Thanks, Pete. And Ellen?
I'm going to go back to a question you asked me earlier that I couldn't answer. A good example. I'm going to take the Grand Canyon. It's a completely different system than anything that hosts specific salmon, but people have been working there for more than 30 years. They started at the local scale of backwaters and sandbars and endangered native fish. And they realized that they had to come up with a numerical model of flow and sediment interactions at the scale of the entire Grand Canyon ecosystem, the river corridor, well over, I don't know what it is in kilometers, a couple 100 kilometers long. Yeah, go slow, keep looking. It's this phrase has been around for a long time, but it is adaptive management. They tried experimental high flow releases and they had the opposite effect of what was intended. So they went back and said, "Oh, what do we need to do to understand to do these more effectively?" And they're getting better and better. So I'll end with that.
And Greer, how about you?
You know what I've been thinking a lot in this context is really about doing not only more intensive restoration, but extensive restoration and being thoughtful about how we apply the concepts we've talked about related to process-based restoration, which really refers to a set of tools, but needs to be expanded to a wider tool set that we apply more intensively and more extensively across the watershed.
Well, that's great. I think that's a nice way to wrap up. I'll say before I turn to Laura to kick us off to lunch, thank you, panel. I've really enjoyed this discussion. You kind of got the wheels turning for me, and some big picture things and some more specific things that I've added to my list of things to think about. And I've enjoyed having time with you here this morning. But Laura, I'll just turn to you for any last word from you, and you can kick us off to lunch.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. I just echo your sentiments of gratefulness to our speakers for sharing their knowledge and insights. And today, I think everybody's going to be walking into lunch with the wheels turning, the gears turning, and lots to think about. So thank you to all of you. And for those online, we're going to be taking a break. The slideshow will run in the background. Please enjoy it if you plan to be watching your screen over lunch, enjoying something to eat. That will showcase projects of some of our audience and the projects they're working on, and we'll all convene back at 1 o'clock for our afternoon with 3 speakers and another panel discussion. So thanks, everybody.